this is Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization.
我现在准备好了。In 80s, when I was working as an English interpreter, I did have a chance to accompany foreign visiting leaders to see the giant panda. Panda is the best ambassador you can imagine, and I hope they will bring peace to the United States and to China-US relations.
While he is all too familiar with the giant panda today, he had no idea how these animals looked like till he was 10.
In the early 1970s, first of all, China was very poor, very backward. Televisions were not readily available. Very few fixed-line telephones. And yes, of course, there was the People's Daily, the official newspaper, but the official daily normally reported about political events. Rarely did they report about animals. So while I, as a kid, knew about giant panda, we actually didn't have a lot of chances to see the giant panda themselves. In 1972, China and the United States agreed that China would dispatch pandas to Washington, D.C. Zoo, actually. The Chinese government did do a lot of media report about sending the giant panda to the United States. It was my first time to see a picture of giant panda, and immediately I was transfixed by the beauty, attractiveness, the magic of the giant panda. What's the meaning of that? I cannot understand, but anyone seeing a panda will fall in immediate love with the panda.
China went on to send many more pandas to all parts of the world. And then it was not just Victor Gao, but the whole world who became enthralled by Chinese pandas. In this two-part series, we figure out, how did pandas go from obscure creatures to being a global sensation?
只要到了伦敦动物园看到熊猫女王，他们就好像忘记了自己正在遭受大轰炸。
And how have these cuddly-looking creatures helped China build ties with the rest of the world?
If China gives you pandas, there is a strong signal that you are a very strategic ally to China.
"我从小的时候跟着我父亲学毛笔书法，长大以后喜欢研究古汉字。我在四川大学的时候，发现很多的汉字在造字的时候，它的本意就教化我们人类人与人怎样和平相处。比如说这个“和”字，啊，这是“和”字的甲骨文，啊，这是粮仓。人与人不友好、不和平就要打仗。 战争就要破坏庄稼，破坏农田，那么人的口里面也没有吃的。从甲骨文到秦始皇统一汉字，把粮仓简化成了口。没有战争，我们粮仓里面有粮，我们口里有吃的。中国文化始终围着人与人的和平发展。我就想到了用一种产品，它能够传播汉字的生态文艺。
Since An Yanshi is a native of Sichuan province, China, he thought of one thing. Organic tea from an area reputed to be the first place in the entire world where tea was first cultivated, Menting Mountain.
我的汉字书画用在了茶的每一款包装上面。09年就开始用牛羊粪去给茶树施肥。 做得很辛苦，因为很普遍。
By now you must be wondering, how are pandas involved in this? Well, there's a reason why An is now in this panda outfit. using cow dung didn't make his organic tea product stand out. Then he got a brilliant idea.
这里其实就是熊猫粪，接近2吨的熊猫粪，堆了一段时间肥，上面看着冒着烟，里面有种生物酶在起作用。这个大熊猫不停地吃，不停地拉，每只大熊猫每天要排泄15到20公斤左右的熊猫粪便。这一坨你看就是熊猫粪。自从我大量的用熊猫粪给茶树施肥，就吸引了国内外的媒体的采访报道，那么网上就开始火起来了。这个茶，中国的祖籍国，但是世界各个地方很多都有了，而熊猫茶只有中国有。野生熊猫所居住的地方就是四川和四川附近的陕西、甘肃。现在熊猫茶出口的越来越多，我们有出口到英国的，到法国的，到美国的，还包括因为新加坡那边的，还有就是一些中东国家。
Well, these countries An is exporting to aren't random. They've all received pandas from China at one point, even the Middle East. Qatar became the first Middle Eastern country to receive pandas in 2022. This strange tale of a wacky entrepreneur making it big off panda poop, it's only possible because of Panda's wildly successful role as a diplomatic ambassador. As of 2024, at least 60 pandas have been sent out to about 23 countries around the world.
Panda diplomacy has been around since the 70s, so it's almost half a century old. It's a crafted symbol of China to revise their image from the sort of more assertive kind of a state to one that seems more friendly and open and welcoming of ties, to create an image of a friendly, cuddly, cute China.
At one of China's largest publishing and distribution companies, at nearly the top floor of this building, there are over 30 staff working on all things pandas. They are headed by Jiang Ling.
现在我们所在的地方是看熊猫杂志社的那个办公区啊，我们这一层楼所有人都在做看熊猫杂志，其实延伸到一个全媒体的传播。很多国外的朋友也是我们的读者，有熊猫的动物园，他们也有我们杂志啊，所以说我们杂志你看，还是一个中英文双语的杂志，我们是1比1的啊，完全是按照中文的内容1比1翻译成英文的。而我们现在的杂志每一期平均能够达到8万册。
Is that a good circulation rate? Well, it's on par with the ultra-stylish Monocle magazine.
是有人问过我们，熊猫能够做到每个月出版1期吗？其实我们做下来不难。我不知道你们有没有概念，我们的圈养熊猫差不多已经达到了700只。
Panda bases are research and breeding facilities for giant pandas. And sometimes their lesser-known cousins, the red pandas. Nearly all the giant pandas on loan to other zoos today originate from one of these bases, not from the wild.
圈养熊猫都有名字，都有性格脾气的描述，也有很多叫明星熊猫啊，受关注的熊猫。我除了是看熊猫杂志主编，其实我也是一个写作者。熊猫花花是我的目前的作品里面卖的最好的。
This book is based on a 3-year-old panda that resides in Chengdu Research Base of giant panda breeding. And yes, she is the A-list panda at the moment. Being a top search term on e-commerce websites, the panda base actually had to rush to register her name and image as a trademark.
花花为什么那么吸引人关注？我这是一只花花的玩偶，我们可以近距离去看一下它。你看它的眼圈啊是倒水滴形，它的嘴筒子比较尖细，下颌要短一些， 耳朵其实也要小一些。我们从背面看一下它啊，它其实是被称为等腰三角猫，等腰三角形，完全像一只卡通熊猫。
Here's Hua Hua with her twin sister. See the difference? She's actually got an exceptionally stunted stature. And the fact that she is a bit too slow, so she always gets her food stolen. And she struggles with a panda's most innate skill, climbing a tree. But she has won adoring fans with her perfect beauty pageant wave. Now, it might seem natural for pandas to have a fandom for being cute. But magazine editor Jiang Lin lets us in on a secret. Something he's learned after researching pandas for the last 7 years.
如果说一只熊猫来了，咱们要做的是机器的不要让它赶紧走。我说的是实话。追溯古代的著作典籍里面，熊猫是凶猛的。
In one legend, the panda is the fearsome mount of an ancient king. In another record, pandas are known as metal-eating monsters. So named because some wild pandas broke into villagers' homes and were seen eating their iron pots.
在古代，我们对大熊猫的认识远远不如今天，所以说当地的老百姓发现熊猫下山铁是铁锅，然后就误认为它在吃铁。
Does that mean pandas' ancient fierce reputation is just one big misunderstanding?
不啊，今天依然凶猛，大熊猫都是非常凶猛的。那么哪怕是我们的圈养熊猫，2岁以后也不太愿意亲近人类，因为在自然界，熊猫本身是独居动物，它一只熊猫享受着好几平方公里的领地。熊猫本身是隐士，非常喜欢安静的生活。大熊猫在我们这个地球上至少生存了800万年，但是人们对它的认识一直不够。这种状态一直持续到1869年，在雅安堡星科学发现大熊猫以后，我们全世界才开始真正的去科学研究它。
A scientific discovery means that a person of science formally saw the panda and decided it is worthy of further study. So who exactly did the scientific discovery and turned pandas from wild animals to worldwide superstars? Well, that guy is not someone from China. We have to journey to the West to find out.
So here I have some of the materials that I've collected over the years that are about the history of pandas and the history of Western fascination with pandas and panda diplomacy over the years. But first, let me show you something over here. We need to start with this man, Father Armand David, who was a French Catholic missionary sent to Sichuan province in the 1860s. In addition to being a missionary, Father David was also a biologist and naturalist. And in 1869, Father David was talking with some local hunters in Sichuan when one of them said that he had an unusual specimen for Father David, and it was the skin of a bear, but it was a bear unlike anything Father David had ever seen, with black and white fur. And so he sent the pelt of the bear back to the National Museum of Natural History in France.
And this was the moment that the world turned its attention to this new species.
At this point, there were no live pandas that had been brought over to the West. This was the artist's best guess of what a panda looked like based on the skins that had been sent back to Paris at this point. as museums in Europe and the United States built their collections of these specimens, there was a certain amount of competition to build the most complete collection, to have the most unusual specimens. And so pandas, which were very few and far between at this time, would have been a prized possession. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a flurry of interest in hunting for pandas. There were a lot of what we might consider National Geographic types, explorers and hunters, going off on an expedition to capture a panda, whether dead or alive, was an enormously costly and time-consuming expedition in the early 20th century. They did so because they thought that capturing a panda or gathering a panda skin for their collection would be a status marker for them. Here I have articles about a woman in New York City, a socialite named Ruth Harkness. After several days searching in Sichuan, she found a wild panda, a baby panda, whom she named Su Lin.
Su Lin was the first panda who came to the United States alive. But within 14 months of arriving in the States, he died and was stuffed. You can still see him at an obscure corner of the Field Museum in Chicago today. His fame was short-lived, not because people lost interest, but because he just didn't get to live very long. Of course, more live pandas later made it to various parts of Europe and the United States. Captured and shipped out of China by Western explorers and hunters.
So this was the beginning of what we might call pandemonium in the late 19th century, as people became fascinated by this completely new species.
我是看熊猫杂志的主编蒋林。我在审稿的过程当中读到一篇文章，名叫《英国老人的最后心愿》。这篇文章其实只有900多字啊，讲的是一个名叫特纳的老人啊，他身患癌症，他此生最后的一个心愿是要到四川成都去看一看熊猫。那么这到底是为什么？因为他突然想起了啊，在他年少的时候有一只名叫明的熊猫。我就在想一个问题，就是说那只熊猫到底在英国经历了什么？它给英国人带去了什么？让一位身患癌症的老人把此生最后的心愿啊，就是到熊猫明的故乡去看一下。我当时就决定，我是一定要把它写下来。然后我就开始投入到浩如烟海的资料的收集当中。我给大家看一下，这个是熊猫明的明信片啊，很漂亮。这张就是很著名的，他成为了摄影师。他在英国是很受欢迎，比如我找到英国女王带着妹妹也去看他，啊，这个呀，英国女王伊丽莎白，这个是她妹妹玛格丽特。哇，熊猫明的故事讲仪，很珍贵的。我是在2018年写《熊猫明历险记》的时候，到处找这本书啊，一直没有找到。熊猫明是1938年去到的英国，当时，学者蒋仪他正在那个地方游学，他去到伦敦动物园去看过它，所以说他的第一手资料，第一个感受是不一样的。
Panda Ming was born in 1937 in Sichuan. However, at just 1 year old, she was caught by a Western explorer, Tangier Smith.
之前史密斯是跟美国人路斯哈克尼斯一起在四川啊来获取熊猫。那么他之前帮助哈克尼斯是把一只熊猫叫做苏林啊带到了美国。那么史密斯为什么在后来要单独到四川来寻找熊猫？ 是因为他觉得所有的光环都被哈克尼斯所拥有，他自己没有得到什么，所以1年以后他就重返中国，然后获得了12只，然后他们到了最后只得去坐船坐船到了伦敦，坐船的时候其实只有5只了。
3 of them were sold to the London Zoo, and as the only baby cub, Ming was naturally the most popular. Of course, it helped that the other 2 pandas sold to the London Zoo died very early. Anyway, children wanted to play with Ming. Crowds thronged the zoo to catch a glimpse of her, but Ming became an even bigger star than Panda Sulin in the US for one reason. At that time, London was under siege during World War II.
英国的媒体人发现了一个特别的现象，就是无论是大人还是小孩，只要到了伦敦动物园看到熊猫敏，他们脸上就有了笑容，他们就好像忘记了自己正在遭受大轰炸。这个时候媒体人的嗅觉就比较灵敏，马上在想办法说，我们应该号召所有的人向这只熊猫学习。你看它背井离乡，环境改变了，食物改变了，甚至它跟我们一样也在遭受轰炸。熊猫敏该吃吃，该喝喝该玩玩，它也没有受到这个战争的干扰。我们每一个人都能够向这只熊猫学习，那么我们相信我们自己能够赢得这场战争的胜利。熊猫敏在那个特殊的年代成了英国人的精神偶像，治愈了一代英国人。
You could say that Ming was the first panda who truly became more than just a cute animal. Ming proved that pandas can rally people through exceptionally hard times. China saw how much soft power a simple panda could command. And that set the stage for China to employ pandas as a diplomatic move for the very first time in modern times, in the thick of World War II.
During the occupation of China by Japan, Americans were incredibly generous to the Chinese people. Resources were sent, money was sent, food was sent. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Madam Chiang, were very, very grateful.
So China in 1941 wasn't the same China that we think of today. This was the Republic of China, which was headed by Chiang Kai-shek. He was the head of the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang.
The United States supported Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang because they were Democrats. Madam Chiang knew that the Bronx Zoo had really wanted pandas. And so 2 baby pandas were caught in the wild and were actually shipped to the United States.
And there was a nationwide contest to name them because they needed names. And the names that were eventually selected were Pandy and Panda. So I'm afraid that the early panda names were really not very inventive. But
we can say that the use of the pandas was a tool for solidifying the relationship, for China giving something at a point where it had very little to give to the United States. Indeed, if you look at the dollar figure of American support to Chiang Kai-shek, it's over $4 billion, as you can see, a very, very sizable contribution. And so in 1941 is actually the first panda diplomacy with the United States.
They're an enduring symbol of US-China allyship during the war.
In 41, when we were dealing with Chiang Kai-shek, we were very comfortable with what was going on in China. We thought we understood the future.
But 8 years later, 1949, there was a change of leadership in China. Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China, while Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan. Communism officially won in China. Now, China and the United States are on opposite sides of the Cold War, which was a battle for supremacy between communism and capitalism. So overnight, any goodwill between China and the US evaporated.
Chairman Mao was openly anti-American. There was no hope in building a relationship with China.
这里就是宽窄巷子，成都的这个最有特点的一个清朝时代古老的一个街道。你看，现在就有很多的熊猫的工艺品。可能很多人认为，熊猫一直是一个中国传统的一个符号。实际上，中国传统的文化的吉祥物是非常多的，有龙啊、凤啊、锦鲤啊、鹤啊。熊猫的话呢，它实际上是没有出现在中国传统的，特别是古代的这样的一个艺术创作里面去的。
Dragons, phoenixes, cranes. These were not symbols that Mao and the communists were eager to draw on because of their association with the imperial past. They wanted to vanquish all of the class differences that had marked China over the past several thousand years, and they wanted to prove that communism was the best path to move forward. So they sought to establish a clean break with the past. Mao and the Communist Party, they needed to find a new animal that could be something of a blank slate, but also be uniquely associated with China. So pandas during that era could be summoned as a symbol because they didn't have a long association in Chinese history or in Chinese culture. They were still a relatively recent phenomenon as far as being popular. They were innocuous, they were non-threatening, and they were the perfect symbol for the new China.
The Cold War was about who was going to be establishing the world order after World War II. Was it going to be the democratic nations of the world, or was it going to be communism? During the period of the Cold War, China did use panda diplomacy to reward its communist friends, such as the Soviet Union and North Korea. They did not send pandas to the democratic nations of the world.
By the early 1950s, none of the zoos in the United States were able to obtain new pandas to replace those had died.
This included Panda and Pandi, whom you might recall were China's first gift to the United States under Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime. Pandi died in 1945, just as World War II ended. And Panda, who was later renamed Susie, died in 1951. Pandas are only found within China because their natural habitat is limited to the forested mountains of southwestern China. Since they could not be found elsewhere, zoos in the West grew quite desperate.
There was an incident in the mid-1960s that showed just how desperate Western zoos were to obtain more pandas. The two zoos in the world outside of China that had pandas were in London and in Moscow.
The London Zoo had Tsitsi. She was sold for a handsome sum to the zoo by an Austrian animal broker who had the means to acquire rare animals from all around the world. While the Moscow Zoo had An. If you recall, he was one of a pair of pandas who was gifted to the Soviet Union by China, as they were socialist allies. Sadly, the other one passed on, leaving him without a mate.
Well, by that point, the Sino-Soviet split happened in 1960, so the two sides weren't talking to each other. Like the Moscow Zoo couldn't go to China and ask for more pandas.
It all started with this man, Nikita Khrushchev. He took over as leader of the Soviet Union in 1953, and he wanted to normalize ties with the West, but not Chairman Mao, who also felt that Khrushchev's other reforms were ideological blasphemy. And it was this split that created one of the most interesting chapters of Pandamania.
The London Zoo had a female panda named Gigi, and the Moscow Zoo had a male panda.
You see where this is going, right?
Even though the two were on opposite sides of the Cold War, they would need to bridge their Cold War ideological differences and work with each other. to discuss the possibility of breeding their two pandas.
In 1966, after 18 months of intense discussions, Qi from the London Zoo flew to the Soviet Union to meet An in the Moscow Zoo.
Unfortunately, the two sides did not get along.
She meant the pandas, not the countries.
One panda attacked the other. They weren't actually interested in each other in any sort of romantic sense, but this very short-lived attempt to bridge Cold War differences does show the possibilities that were inherent in these panda relationships around the world.
Qi never mated nor produced cubs for the West. Just as the West was running out of options,
in 1972, China and the United States managed to break the deep ice which separated China and the United States for decades.
In 1972, then US President Richard Nixon visited China. He was the first US president to ever do so, all in a bid to normalize relations between the two countries.
As part of the important initiative, China and the United States agreed that China would dispatch pandas to the United States, to Washington, D.C. Zoo, actually.
Meet Ling Ling and Sing Sing, the first pair of pandas gifted to a democratic country by the People's Republic of China.
I think pandemonium is going to break out right here at the zoo.
For the People's Republic of China to send over two of its most precious national treasures to a country that only a few years before it had been openly feuding with. This was showing that the two countries weren't going to have a short-lived relationship.
The Chinese government did do a lot of media report about sending the giant panda to the United States. In such a joyful, happy occasion, it brought happiness and great joy to the Chinese people and the American people.
China in 1972 was a very, very depressed nation. The economy was in a shambles. America was a rich, powerful nation with economic resources, and the Chinese, I think, could see forward that if they improved the relationship with Washington, other democratic nations would follow. Moreover, Mao was worried that the Soviet Union might attack. The Soviet Union put massive numbers of tactical nuclear weapons along the border, and if the Soviet Union attacked, Mao would need a friend. So Mao had powerful reasons to choose the United States as the nation in the West to begin the normalization.
So, from this point on, who got pandas from China looked very different. In 1972, Japan. In 1973, France. 1974, Britain and Germany. 1975, Mexico. 1978, Spain.
This is not a disparate set of countries. They are basically countries that the PRC believed were reliably anti-Soviet, who could help provide a bulwark against Soviet pressures. It really allowed them to have a lot of space, and that space also afforded the PRC the ability to have someone like Deng Xiaoping come up and do opening and reform. He had a very difficult situation to contend with. It's not just the poverty. Social trust had broken down. You had a situation where the Chinese Communist Party was also tearing itself apart. What are you going to tell the Chinese population to say, you have to keep supporting us, you should not resist?
So we've got a document here of the lease agreement with the DC Zoo, obtained by the Freedom of Information Act. Have a look at it.
Okay, thank you. So the document is titled Agreement Between the Smithsonian Institution, National Zoological Park, and the Chinese Wildlife Conservation Association concerning the giant pandas.
This is the Panda Agreement between China and the DC Zoo for the pandas Tiantian and Meixiang. They are the second generation of pandas that was sent to Washington, D.C.'s Smithsonian Zoo in the year 2000 to replace the famous 1972 pair, Ling Ling and Sing Sing, that was sent to the U.S. when U.S. was normalizing relations with China. But while Ling Ling and Sing Sing were gifts, the terms for Tian Tian and Mei Xiang were very different.
So the terms of the agreement is that the American side will transfer to the Chinese side $500,000 a year for each panda. The American side will pay insurance of $1 million a year on the pandas. If there is a death of a panda, the United States would pay $800,000. I have not seen a document like this. I find it extremely interesting, actually, to see how specific it is.
There's even an appendix where it's revealed that through friendly consultation, the Smithsonian, which is the organization that runs the zoo in DC, will pay the China Wildlife Conservation Association an additional donation.
So they got an extra $250,000 over 5 years. The Chinese side realizes how much the Smithsonian likes having the pandas and that they are in a position to ask for more, and clearly the Smithsonian was willing to pay it.
It's not just with the Smithsonian Zoo in the US. Since 1984, the Republic of China stopped gifting pandas and instead loaned them out for a fee. These loans can be extended upon discussion between both parties.
This is in keeping with overall Chinese society, where they move to a more capitalist-minded system. So if the Americans are willing to pay top dollar for pandas, well, then China should take advantage of that opportunity. I think one thing we have to understand is China changed. You'll remember when Deng Xiaoping comes into power, one of his most famous phrases is, "To get rich is glorious."
致富光荣, whether it was actually spoken is in some dispute. What Deng actually apparently did say was, 黑猫白猫能抓老鼠就是好猫. So it doesn't matter whether your cat is black or whether it's white, so capitalist, socialist, as long as you can make your country rich and powerful, and it's a means to do so. But let's get rich, and your lives will get better. To me, this is the performance legitimacy that actually still remains very important for the Chinese Communist Party today.
In more ways than one, part of that money-making strategy involves offering pandas to so many countries. Each pair of pandas is loaned out at a hefty fee of up to $1 million per pair per year.
So this chart is particularly interesting because there is actually quite a good, clear linear relationship between the number of pandas that were offered out as well as the trading volumes. On the y-axis is the number of pandas that were actually offered out of China to these various recipient countries. On the x-axis is the trading volumes between China and the recipient economy in US dollar terms.
In layman's terms, this graph shows that the more a country does business with China, the more pandas that country gets.
Here we have Japan, which China has offered up 9 pandas as of 2019. Japan enjoys quite a big, substantial trading relationship with China of about $300 billion as of 2019. And if you go all the way to the right-hand side of this chart, you have the US, which has been the recipient of 11 pandas as of 2019. The US is actually the recipient of the most number of pandas from China. And it has a trading relationship that's twice the size of Japan. These are the 2 most prosperous economies in the world. So it's not surprising that China really wants to cement some of these key trading economic relationships with these 2 economies.
This was the strategy that China settled on to get rich and glorious through the late 1980s to 2000s, becoming the world's manufacturing hub. China would make stuff, all kinds of stuff, then export it to rich countries who can spend on these goods. What they spend flows into China, and China gets rich fast.
So the export-oriented route that China took in its economic development is perhaps not the only route to prosperity, but it is the fastest route. Now, what this chart doesn't show is that post-2019, the influence of geopolitics, the influence of some of these tensions between economies, a lot of the external influences that has come into play when it comes to China's economic strategy.
The year is 2019, April 2019 to be exact. Remember that pandas are now loaned out, and these loans are often extended, usually 10 years at a time. But very quietly, the loan for the San Diego Pandas expires. Two pandas, Bai Yun and Xiao Li Wu, return to China. April 2023, the loan agreement expires at Memphis Zoo. The elderly panda, 23-year-old Ya Ya, returns to China. December 2023. The loan agreement at the Smithsonian Zoo, Washington, D.C. expires as well. 3 pandas, including the cub, leave the US for China. This means, all of a sudden, the only pandas left in the United States are the ones in the Atlanta Zoo. And as their loan agreement is set to expire in late 2024, the fear is that these 4 will have to leave as well. And the United States would go from having the most number of pandas to no pandas for the first time in 50 years. What happened?
China raided our factories, offshored our jobs, gutted our industries, stole our intellectual property, and violated their commitments under the World Trade Organization.
President Trump, he had actually got his mandate by being quite adversarial when it comes to China. So in 2018 and 2019, this is the start of President Trump himself imposing tariffs on some of these goods from China, which effectively made Chinese goods more expensive for the American consumer, effectively priced China out and made China's growth model of being reliant on exports not such a good strategy.
China retaliated in kind, with tariffs of their own on US goods.
The start of what the economic history books like to call the trade wars. And the consequence of that is that at the end of 2-3 years, China's trade to the US has actually fallen by something like 20%.
China is now a major world power. It's more able and therefore willing to show its assertive side. It feels it has a need to sort of sometimes put a harsher face, and is able to do so. That's what it does. I want to emphasize many great powers act in a similar way. China's no exception.
For those who think that China wants to withdraw pandas from the United States to show its displeasure, I think that's probably a little bit too naive. After all, the Chinese nation has been here for 5,000 years, and we have learned a lot throughout history. And we do attach great importance to China-US relations, to promoting friendship and cooperation. I really believe that the probability of the United States having no panda on a permanent basis is 0.
In fact, less than 10 days after the pandas left Washington, D.C. Zoo, President Xi Jinping made this comment at the APEC leaders meeting in California.
华盛顿国家动物园的3只大熊猫回到中国。我还了解到圣达哥动物园和加州人民热切期盼大熊猫能重返加州。大熊猫是中美人民的友谊使者，我们愿意继续同美国开展大熊猫保护合作。
Xi Jinping, in front of a large crowd, said that the San Diego Zoo will get their pandas again. In this last year, I have become convinced that panda diplomacy is an area that can really help to improve the relationship with China at very little cost to either side. So many of the other issues we deal with are highly intractable, whether it is on technology to China, the issues of exit bans on Americans going to China. There are just a huge number of issues that are difficult. Whereas panda diplomacy is a win-win for both sides. It's easy to do. The Chinese have pandas. We have zoos ready to take them.
It's not just the zoos in the US. Other zoos also pull out all the stops for these diplomatic animals.
Not all animals can have its own palace, but panda can have its own palace.
Jaga dia 100% dengan istilah come from hati. It's like the family, one family.
弘毅 good girl 啦，ใช่ไหม